Welcome back to Talk Jamaica here on Talk Jamaica Radio. We are streaming live on talkjamaicaradio.com, and we're now going to take you inside our Talk Vault feature. Listeners, the National College for Educational Leadership, NCEL, as an agency of the modernized Ministry of Education, was established in 2011 under the Education System Transformation Program with the mandate to develop excellent leadership in Jamaica's education system by creating world class educational leaders. Prior to the introduction of NCEL, many of the training programs for principals were largely theoretical. While a strong theoretical underpinning is vital, there was the need to vary the modalities of training to shift the balance from the acquisition of knowledge to individual development and growth and the improvement of skills and competencies. NCEL's programs, which are all competency based, are delivered by experienced facilitators within their given fields. The college offers training programs for every educational leadership professional. Mrs. Rosemary Campbell Stevens is the new head of NCEL. She insists that the country's school leaders can play a greater role in helping Jamaicans develop a stronger sense of identity, purpose, and self determination. According to Miss Rosemary Campbell Stevens, this sense of self, coupled with a belief in one's capacity to make a difference, needs to be a fundamental component of the national development process. So we have today in Talk Vault the head of NCEL, Rosemary Campbell Stevens. Good evening, Miss Stevens, and welcome.
Good evening. Good evening to you.
All right. You have a task on your hand, and I'm sure you are up to it. If you could tell our listeners what is it that you hope to achieve, what your main focus as the head of NCEL.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. It is a task, but it's a task that I am very glad and privileged to have, in that I believe that NCEL is an excellent brand and that the work that it has been doing to date has really begun to propel leadership in Jamaica of our schools into an arena where we're actually linking more explicitly the leadership of schools with nation building. And I suppose that's where I come in, because that's my vision for the National College for Educational Leadership, that whilst we engage our leaders in professional development that enables them to lead their schools well, that we also engage them in a much bigger conversation about the role of school leadership in creating the kind of citizens that we need for nation building. And I think that's where the National College now is on its journey. And to be honest with you, I think that the leadership of schools are ready for this. I think that there is a sense within the system that too much professional development, possibly in the past, not just through NCEL, but in other spheres, has been focused on identifying the gaps in terms of the competencies, and that while there are some gaps to be filled, there are many school leaders who are very competent, are leading schools well, and really what we need is to be looking at the extent to which that leadership is actually taking our nation forward. And that then means that we have to challenge some of the practices, some of the ways of being, some of the ways of seeing that we've taken for granted to date.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I find, Mrs. Campbell Stevens, and as an educator myself, is that we tend to not bring on board the community, yes? Having
Yes.
them recognize that they are a part of the whole teaching learning process. So how is there any emphasis within NCEL that focuses on that so that our principals, our leaders can recognize that the community, the parents, every single person has a role to play.
Absolutely. I think that is a vital observation in terms of where we need to go, and we need to get better at it. Um, we're there, and I consider myself to be part of the process. We, school leadership, the Ministry of Education, is there to serve. We're there to serve the communities, and so in terms of schools working within the communities that they serve, an important part of their mandate is to actually start from where, well, every good teacher knows that what you do is to start from where your student is at, and definitely schools need to start from where their communities are. And so it's a shoulder to shoulder process. And by that I mean that our parents, the other agencies that are working alongside parents and schools in terms of building communities, it's a shoulder-to-shoulder process where we all come together, and there has to be better acknowledgement. You are absolutely right about the role, the knowledge, the capacity that communities have in terms of making the educational process one that is a holistic one. So that does require a bit of reimagining on the part of school leaders. And it also needs us to confront the fact that our education system is very stratified, as Jamaican society is. It's stratified by class, it's stratified by color, it's stratified by our history and by socioeconomic background. And so we need to be a little less ambivalent about how the majority of Jamaicans have a role to play in terms of shaping our society. And education must be an enabling process. It can't be one that continues to sift out those people who don't come from the right socioeconomic background, who speak in a particular way, who don't have the currency that the system tends to value. And so you are right. If you're going to be a successful school leader, you must be less contemptuous, if I can say that, of the communities that you serve.
And I'm glad you brought up the issue, Ms. Rosemary Campbell Stevens, of the whole education stratification in terms of class and color. Because my next question is going to be, how do we approach the whole issue of equity in our classrooms? How do we approach the whole issue of equity in our schools so that our children can recognize and take that issue of equity within the wider society?
Well, another superb question. At a system level, we have to really go through almost what the South African society went through after the apartheid regime. And I'm not trying in any way to be sensational by making that comparison, but I am trying to underline the depth of what needs to happen. And the depth of what needs to happen is that there needs to be some kind of truth and reconciliation. And what I mean by that is that we acknowledge the truth of the root of our education system. If we acknowledge the truth of the root of our education system, then we understand that the education system that we have inherited, it has inequality and inequity built into it. It's a public school system that is built on and replicates in many ways the system that I grew up and was brought up in the UK. And, there is widespread acknowledgement that such systems, and I mean the public school systems that are there for the majority of young people in nations like the UK, US, elsewhere, are not really based on ensuring that the majority of young people come out properly educated. It is stratified and it's meant to cream off the top, um, actually 5% in terms of real education. And then if we go down to the 30%, then they tend to get a slightly better education, and 70% get a very, very fundamental basic education. So the first thing to do is to come to terms with that. And then it's to reconcile ourselves with, well, what vision do we have for our society? What vision do we have for our country? And will the vehicle that we currently have by way of an education system take us there? And so it's not about apportioning blame. It's not about us going into denial, but it is about saying that a system that was set up for one purpose is not necessarily going to be the system that takes us forward. And so if we're really going to address in any meaningful way the whole issue of inequity within our society, and get away from this notion of the deserving and the undeserving, through our processes and through the way that we actually ration education, then one of the things that we have to do is to grasp this inequity and tell the truth. And the truth is that 70% of young people in Jamaica don't matriculate. And even those that do matriculate are only partially educated. So is that going to turn us into a 21st century first world developed nation? Hell no. And so the more we begin to tell the truth and then decide, okay, so what is it that we're going to do and how are we going to do it, then the better we're going to be.
Share with our listeners, if you will, Miss Campbell Stevens, your training and your background. As I gather from what you said, you grew up in the UK.
Yes, I did. I'm a daughter of Jamaican nationals, so I consider myself a Jamaican national. My parents hail from Hanover, and that is the parish to which I and my husband have returned, in inverted commas, last year. I live next door to my two siblings, my sister and her husband, and my brother and his wife. So yes, I grew up in the UK, the first generation born in the UK to Jamaican parents. I went to school there, have had all of my working life there, and I'm an educator. I went to university, trained as a teacher, and then have worked within the system in the UK for 35 years. Even as I say it, I'm shocked, but it is 35 years I've worked in the system in the UK. And so during that time, I have done many things. I've been a principal of school. I have been an inspector, an Ofsted inspector. I've been an education officer, and I've also worked for the Department for Education in the UK as an advisor, and then latterly with the National College for Teaching and Leadership in the UK, and with University College London as a visiting fellow, where I've developed some leadership programs for them. So done the full gamut, if you like, of education. Education's been my life. But throughout that process, one of the things that I have been fighting for within education in the UK is a more equitable education system for working class youngsters and for black and other global majority youngsters within the system, because we face some of the same issues that the Jamaican education system faces here.
Mm-hmm. And finally, Miss Campbell Stevens, this is an issue that I'm sure you will agree with me on, is the whole way in which, after our principals get these training, how do we implore on them now to become the transformational leaders that we want them to be? Because it's not only about getting the information and the theory, but how do we put into practice what they have gotten?
Again, an excellent question from you. That's where I feel that NCEL, the National College for Educational Leadership, now has a slightly different role to simply delivering the training. And so when I took up post on the 1st of July, one of the things that we did as a team was to go away together and actually discuss the direction of travel now for the National College. Of course, we still have the remit for training, but we also need to engage, as I said, in a much bigger conversation, which I believe many principals are ready for, about their role. And their role has to be in terms of being able to develop some kind of consensus amongst themselves about educational purpose. What's the role of education in a mature society, as Jamaica is, but in a transitioning society? And so what it needs is a change. And it can't be a change that is just about tweaking around the periphery of what we're doing. It has to be a fundamental change in terms of our thinking about educational purpose and therefore our educational processes. And it's the school leaders that need to drive that. And so part of where we are as a National College for Educational Leadership is actually saying to school leaders, yes, there's the Ministry of Education, but actually you are the people who are leading the system. The National College for Educational Leadership is there to support training and development, but actually there needs to be a different narrative among school leaders about how they then put that training into action. So you're absolutely right. Within the training itself, we're beginning to ask big questions of principals. So we're beginning to ask the questions about, to what extent do you actually engage with the communities that you serve? To what extent do your processes reflect your values? If you say that part of what education is supposed to be about, for example, and I would imagine that most schools would say this, is that part of what education is about is supposed to be about is to enable our young people to learn in dignity and to grow as dignified people. Are our processes dignified? Do we treat people with dignity? Are they learning in environments that would, be conducive to that way of being and seeing? Do all of our teachers and, other members of staff who work within the school treat the young people with dignity and in the same time treat each other with dignity? So it's, if you like, it's transferring A, the theory, B, the practice that NCEL has been focusing on into, well, what does that look like in your school? How will I see that? And because most principals, and not all, but most, and, we might have to have a different tact with those who are in the system for different reasons. But I believe that most principals really do have a belief that they are there to make a positive difference. One of the things that they need to do is to have the confidence in their conviction that all of those hours spent is actually making a difference. And we have to model that. School leaders have to model that which they seem to they seek to inculcate in their students. They have to. But a lot of them lack confidence more than anything else. And it's not about resources. Because a lot of people keep saying to me, well, we haven't got the resources. It's about mindset. It's about mindset. It's not about the more dollars.
Right.
We could do with more dollars. But some of the best teaching takes place under a tree with people who go into that situation with a belief that they have the efficacy to make a difference, and go in with a coming from a position of love rather than contempt, and rather than wanting to sift out children at every opportunity. I've been saying to school leaders, you need to be leading schools that you would be happy to see your own child or your own grandchild sat in that classroom. And if you're not happy for them to be sat in that classroom, then what is it that you would want to change so that would be the case?
All right. Can I thank you very much, Rosemary Campbell Stevens, for having joined us this afternoon?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Really appreciate your insight, and we look forward to hearing more from NSEL and the vigor and the efficiency and effectiveness that you plan to bring to this college.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. And might I just say to your listeners, please look out for our inaugural conference, which will be held next year, February 2017, week beginning the 20th of February. I've yet to settle on the date, and the theme will be disrupting the narrative.
All right, we'll bring you back, Ms. Campbell, to talk more about that when the time gets near.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Listeners, you heard her there. She's Rosemary Campbell Stevens. She's the head of NSEL, the National College for Educational Leadership, really telling us our insight as to what she plans for that college. And I believe our takeaway from that is the whole idea that as principals, these principals and school leaders, they must approach the whole issue of education with an open mind and with the idea to make a difference.